So now that I have this basic good stuff, bad stuff mechanic where I can run around and pick up uh, good objects and contribute to my points, or I can come across these bad objects where it'll reduce my points, I want to integrate that into some kind of basic gameplay. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I want to build a system, a health manager system, or a player life manager system that that will respawn in the event that my points reach 0. I want to respawn back to the beginning of the map. Now, my idea is I want to build a more comprehensive kind of player manager system that might be I get 3 chances or 3 lives, and each time my health gets reduced to 0, I lose a life. But rather than trying to design a comprehensive player manager system from the ground up, all in one motion, what I want to do is start to build simple mechanics that I can string together to build a more comprehensive system. And so the first thing I'll start to work on is this idea of a respawn. So I can take my player character and move it to a predetermined position. Now, in order to do this, I want to build an interaction that I can control so that I can troubleshoot this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a simple platform out of a cube. I'm going to take this cube and put it into a position where I can very easily interact with it. So I'll move it pretty close to where my player character is. I have a couple of materials here to set up so that I can, have some visual cues as to what I'm looking at. And I'm going to bump the size up as well a little bit just to make this look a little different than anything else. Now, I'm going to build a very simple machine that when I walk across this platform or I cross the threshold of the collider, we trigger an event that relocates the player to a different position. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up this platform, and rather than call it cube, I'll call this teleport. And I'm building a respawn system, but I'm going to create a little mechanic that'll probably be more like a teleport, where we enter a teleport platform and it changes our position. And this might be something that I want to use not only in my health system, but maybe I want to integrate this mechanic on my island elsewhere. So I can repurpose some of these basic machines that we'll build. So I have this teleport platform. I'm going to right click and add an FSM to this platform. And basically this first state is just going to be an idle state. It's going to sit and listen for some interaction with the player. With that state selected, I'm going to go into physics and I'm looking to trigger an event. So I'll double click on trigger event. And what I want to do is on enter with this trigger, when I collide with the player character, now my player, if I go to first person controller, I can look up here under tag and I see that my first person controller is tagged with the tag of player. And so I'll filter based on, we'll collide with the tag of player. That way if I have some bad guys chasing me at some point, they won't teleport and follow me through the teleporter. But we want to filter that collision with the player. And again, this is so we can test our respawn. And the send event that I want to send is missing. I don't have any send event, and so I'm going to create a teleport event. Just call this teleport or T-port. Well, I'll leave that mistake in there for now, and I'll set that to T-port. I'll right click on my state and add it as a transition, and I'll wire that transition event over to a second state. Now the second state, this is where we're actually going to respawn our player character. Now I can already test this, okay? And now before I test this, I do want to demonstrate that I have a send event that I have a typo in it. I'm just going to go back in, select that event, and I'll fix that typo, and you'll see that Playmaker is very good about correcting mistakes and updating that across the board. So I just updated that event name, and you can see that the Playmaker handled that reference and updated all the references to it. So I'm in idle. When I trigger this with the player, I want to fire off the teleport action. So my teleport or my respawn state doesn't really do anything at this point, but I can test the machine. So I'll run over and I'll interact with my cube, and I'm expecting to see that action fires. You can see that it did not fire. And the reason it didn't fire is because I'm listening for a trigger event. And when I listen for a trigger event, I got to make sure that the collider that I'm running into, I'll go over here into the component, is set to is trigger. I'll hit the play button again, and when I run over and trigger this platform, you can see that my action fires. I'm watching down in the Playmaker editor window, and I can see that it fired off to the respawn. Now, when it comes to the respawn, I could hardwire some coordinates into this and just set the position of the player character somewhere in space. But what I want to do is, rather than set the position on respawn to something that I've hardwired, what I want to do is I'm going to create a game object, and I'll create something like a sphere. And this will give me a visual representation of the position that I want to respawn to. So I'm just going to move this in space. I'll leave it up in the air so that it's pretty obvious what I'm doing here. I'm going to use the position of that sphere and respawn the player character to that position. Now, typically when you're looking to do something like this, when you're going to reference the position of an object, I'm choosing to use a game object that has some geometry associated with it, just so I can see it a little bit more clearly. But typically I would do this in a create empty game object. So if I create an empty game object, you can see that this is an empty object that simply has a transform component. So there's no other components associated with this object, so it just has a coordinate system. It says game object over here, and empty game objects are handy because you can use those as placeholders for things. You can also group objects and parent objects into empty game objects. So there's a lot of reasons that you might want to use an empty game object. I just threw my sphere inside, or I parented my sphere to that empty game object, but I'll delete that empty game object because I'm going to use the sphere for now. Now, rather than use a straight sphere in the title, I'm going to call this spawn location. More appropriately, I probably should call this player spawn location, but my scene isn't too big and too complex yet at this point. Now, there is one thing I want to point out, that in the event that you're using a game object with geometry and with a collider that you're ultimately going to spawn or move objects to, it's a good practice to turn off the sphere collider. Because in the condition that maybe you build some kind of a first-person shooter or a third-person vehicle game, and your game calls for projectiles being shot from a position, if you're using a game object to reference that point where something should be spawned, you run the risk of colliding with that object in that location. And so an easy fix to that is simply find the collider associated with the object that you're referencing its position and just turn off its collider. So I'm unchecking that no longer has a collider, an active collider on it. So I have this object called spawn location, and I have my teleport object. I'm going to go back into my teleport object because currently that's where it's holding my temporary state machine that's going to act as the teleport. And remember, we're listening for a trigger event. When that trigger event with the player happens, it fires off this respawn. Now, once we respawn, what I want to do is I want to get the location of my game object, because I'm going to use that as a reference to where I move the player character to. Now, again, I could hardwire this action to this position, but it's much more flexible if you just reference the game object's position. Because currently my position is up here, I can see it, and if I hard code that into my machine, then I'm kind of stuck there, and every time I want to change that location, I have to go back into that machine and reference it. So the way I'm going to do this is on my respawn action on my teleport, I'm going to do a get location or a get position. And I can find that in transform. Inside the transform category, I'm going to get the position. I'll double click to add that to my state. I don't want to get the position of the owner of this FSM, because remember, the owner of this state machine is the teleport. That's the platform. We already know that position. We don't really care to know what that position is. What I want to do is where it says game object, I'm going to choose the drop-down menu and choose to specify a game object. So in other words, I'm getting the position of a different game object, not the teleport platform. The position I want to get is the spawn location. So I'm going to drag the spawn location over into the field as looking for a game object, and then I want to store it as a vector3 variable. Now if I click on this drop-down menu, you can see that I have no choices of variables to store this in. And whenever I see a vector3, it's basically a combination of an XYZ coordinate system. So I need to create a vector3 coordinate variable, or vector3 variable. So I'm going to go over to my variables tab. I'm going to create a new variable, and I'll just call this spawn position. And instead of the variable type being a float, I'm going to set this to vector3. And I'll add that to my state machine. I'll go back to the state tab where I'm doing the get action. I'm getting the action of our little spawn sphere over here. And I'm going to store that in this vector3 variable that I just created. So in other words, once the teleport action fires off and we get to the respawn state, what we're going to do is we're going to get the location of our sphere, we're going to store it in a vector, and then we're going to do a set position. There it is. It's under transform, set position. And I want to make sure that that set position shows up underneath the get position. So I'm going to move get position up. So first we get position. Then we're going to set position. I want to set the position not of the owner game object of this state machine, because that would take the teleport platform and move it. What I want to do is I want to set the position of a game object. I'm going to specify the first person controller as the game object that I want to relocate, and the location that I want to move it to is the vector3, which is spawn position. So in other words, the first action on this state gets the position of this sphere. The second action sets and moves the first person controller to the location. So I'm going to hit the play button. I'm going to test this to make sure that it works, and my expectation is that when I cross this collider on this blue cube, we're going to change the position of the sphere, and it worked like a charm. Okay, so now the beauty of this kind of setup is that we could have, in the respawn, we could have set the position and we could have manually fed in the XYZ coordinate system here. But the nice thing about this is that once we establish a spawn location, we can move that spawn location anywhere we want. So I could just take this and maybe move it over my dangerous cubes and just, just drop myself into a dangerous place here. So because I've moved that spawn position, when I run this machine, it gets the location of that current position. So now when I respawn into that position. So this can be a very valuable thing to track that location. We can also do kind of almost like a goal system to where as we make progress and we respawn, instead of respawning back to the beginning of the island, maybe you respawn like a quarter or a third of the way through, and you go on your journey again, as long as you have enough resources. So we have this basic respawn or relocation, this teleport platform, so we can repurpose that concept or that machine back into our player manager. But we'll do that in the next presentation.